Welcome to Dataless You. I'm Paul, coming to you from Brooklyn. Today we'll take a look at the art of the essay. We'll attempt to come up with a thesis for Toni Morrison's masterful novel, The Bluest Eye. I'm excited about our work today. I have been immersed in the world and mind and work of Toni Morrison over the past few weeks, and I want to share with you my own struggle in coming up with what to talk about today. And my struggle is the same as yours as a student. Maybe you've been assigned this book and you have to write a paper and you have to come up with a thesis, and so that's what we're going to do here today together. So let's get started. The Bluest Eye is Toni Morrison's first novel. You can peruse the details here. It's set in Ohio, and it focuses on Pecola Breedlove, who of course is the young girl in the book who has a strong desire to have blue eyes. And we'll see why in just a moment. I am most impressed by this novel for its plethora, its cornucopia of voices of the African American community. Pecola's mother, Pauline, in one section of the novel, speaks in the first person, and we hear of her experience as a mother. Much of the novel is told from the perspective of another 11-year-old girl, friend of Pecola's, named Claudia. And so we see and hear the world from her perspective. Towards the end of the book, there's a rather fascinating character, Soped Church, and we see the world from his point of view in third person, but also in the form of a letter that he pens to God. And Soped Church is certainly a interesting character, to say the least. And some of the best moments of The Bluest Eye are merely the dialogue between the townswomen. For example, when Cholly, and that's Pecola's father, when he passes away, when Cholly's aunt, that is, passes away, there's just a really lovely moment when all of the women from the town are sort of sitting around at her deathbed, discussing their own pains and illnesses through the years. So I would most heartily recommend the novel, most for its depiction of African American culture in a very particular time and place in Ohio in the 1930s. It's unlike any other book I've read in that regard, in terms of opening my own eyes to this world. It's interesting how Toni Morrison constructs the book, and I've done a brief study of the narrative structure, as you see here. These are the page numbers, and they're broken down into the different sections. And I just sort of want to briefly indicate how Morrison's novel very much is a modernist novel. She was educated woman. She wrote her master's thesis on the work of William Faulkner and Virginia Woolf, two towering figures in modernist literature. And you can see that influence in this book. As you see here, The Bluest Eye moves through a whole strain of different point of views and narrative strategies. The predominant one, as I've mentioned, is Claudia's point of view. Now, Claudia is a friend of Pecola, so she's really an observer character, a classic observer character. She is watching all of the action unfolds, and yet at the same time, she is a young girl, just like Claudia, subject to the same forces of society. And in many ways, though, Claudia is a kind of counterpoint to the experience of Pecola. Again, we'll see more about that momentarily. But the novel also rather skillfully jumps into the past and tells the past story in the second half of the novel of both Pecola's mother and father. So as you see, for about 21 pages, we get the story of Pauline, and that section is the one where we have an alternating third-person point of view, and then this sort of italicized first-person narrative that is in Pauline's voice, in her own voice. And then we get a longer even section about Cholly, and Cholly is Pecola's father. We hear really his full backstory. He sort of was abandoned by his parents, raised by his aunt, and even had a point when he confronts his father, when he chases him down in Macon, in the town of Macon. His father essentially says, "Get the hell out of my face. I don't know who you are, kid." And this extended backstory of Cholly is, again, something we're going to pay closer attention to as we try to brainstorm our thesis. Because the way Morrison tells us the story of Cholly invokes a great deal of sympathy. And by the time the novel comes to its climax, which in fact is Cholly's rape of his own daughter, Pecola. By the time we come to that scene in the novel, we've developed so much sympathy for Cholly that it's a challenge in a way for the reader to read the scene and to sort of interpret the events and to even judge sort of what is happening. As I mentioned, there's another character, Soped Church, and we see a letter he writes to God. So I just wanted to emphasize the innovative narrative structure in this novel and point out how Morrison is clearly drawing on the modernist writings of the previous 50 or so years, particularly that of Faulkner and Virginia Woolf. So how do we put all this together? Well, I've attempted here a kind of map of the narrative arcs in this novel. And this is the kind of thing that you could do on your own when sort of brainstorming and trying to figure out a book. We have Pecola, who's in many ways a tragic protagonist, unique, but certainly has a kind of rise and fall in her story. Similarly, the mother, who, as I've mentioned, has sort of her own story within the book, has a sort of a classic rise and fall to her story as well. Claudia is going to occupy the middle ground. She's the observer character. I've just noted some sort of key events or quotes here, and you can peruse this at your leisure. Soped Church comes in later. He's another observer character. He, like us, is watching this family Breedlove drama unfolds. And then Cholly is a kind of anti-hero, but of course we're going to talk more about Cholly and our sympathies for him in just a moment. But his story is one of those that sort of starts badly and goes down from there. He's abandoned by his parents, his aunt dies. There's a key moment when he's having his first sexual experience. He's at the funeral for his aunt Jimmy, and he runs off with this young girl Darlene, and they sort of step in these berries and run off into the field, and one thing leads to another, and they're making out. And it's at this moment when a couple of white men accost Cholly and Darlene from behind, and they're shining a flashlight on his behind, on his naked bottom, and demanding that he continue, and that they watch. And so here, in this key moment, we have Cholly's first sexual experience rudely interrupted by the racism of his world, by these white men who feel they can get away with anything, such as this kind of degradation and humiliation. So, again, I recommend this kind of sketching out of the narrative arcs whenever you're trying to figure out a book. But let's get down to it. What might our thesis be? I've written down a couple of ideas here. We're going to end up pursuing number 4, but I'm going to take my time with these first 3. So the first idea is something that we've already been discussing. You could sort of do a literary analysis on the narrative structure and write a thesis about how The Bluest Eye is really a modernist novel. It was published in 1970, so it's late in terms of modernism, but it's certainly influenced by shifting point of views. There is some stream of consciousness in Pauline's voice. And I think that would make for a very interesting investigation if you wanted to do that for your thesis. You could also take a kind of sociological angle and look at Pecola, who again is our protagonist, as the embodiment of the negative, so to speak. And to give you an idea of what I mean, I think it's best if we go ahead and read this extended quote from page 205. So again, Pecola is the main character of the novel. She's a young girl. She is the one who has this desire for blue eyes. And of course, the desire for blue eyes is really something she gets from looking at all the images of cute little white girls and their blue eyes that would have surrounded her in this 1930s Lorain, Ohio world. But more than that, and worse in a way than that, is how within her own African American community, Pecola seems to absorb, as it says here, all of our waste which we dumped on her and she absorbed. Absorb all of the waste and hatred and really self-contempt of the African American community. Even her mother, even Pauline in the section in her voice, talks about how Pecola was such an ugly little child. And this is the weight that Pecola carries around, and worse, this is the role that she plays in her community. So I'm going to read this long quote on 205. It begins with, "All of our waste which we dumped on her and which she absorbed, and all of our beauty which was hers first and which she gave to us. All of us, all who knew her, felt so wholesome after we cleaned ourselves on her. We were so beautiful when we stood astride her ugliness. Her simplicity decorated us, her guilt sanctified us, her pain made us glow with health, her awkwardness made us think we had a sense of humor. Her inarticulateness made us believe we were eloquent. Her poverty kept us generous. Even her waking dreams we used to silence our own nightmares. And she let us, and thereby deserved our contempt. We honed our egos on her, padded our characters with her frailty, and yawned in the fantasy of our strength. Pecola here is the product of racial oppression. She is the embodiment of a kind of excess blackness, a kind of blackness that even her own community negates. And again, all of this self-contempt, I think Morrison is telling us, is the product of ubiquitous racial oppression. So certainly a close analysis of Pecola and her role, not only as the girl who wants blue eyes, which of course is the title of the book, and so fairly obvious, but her role as the pole that must absorb all of this hatred and ugliness would make for a terrific investigation in your paper. The third idea that I think is rich and meaningful is the notion of the sympathy generated throughout this novel for Cholly. Now, you might think of a book like Vladimir Nabokov's Lolita in this regard. In that famous novel, Nabokov tried through the brilliance of the prose, the brilliance of the voice of Humperdinck Humperdinck, really to elicit a kind of sympathy for Humperdinck, who was in fact a pedophile. He, of course, carries on a relationship with young Lolita in the novel. In a similar vein, here in The Bluest Eye, Toni Morrison seems particularly intent on eliciting our sympathy, the reader's sympathy, that is, for the character of Cholly. I've shared with you the details of the scene of his own first sexual experience where he's humiliated by the two white men. In that very scene, there's also really lovely gestures that Cholly makes with Darlene. We see essentially what I would call Cholly's tenderness. And tenderness is a word that Morrison uses with full purpose in the actual rape scene later on in the novel. So when Cholly's raping his own daughter, Pecola, Morrison writes about the tenderness with which he touches her, the tenderness with which he tries to essentially communicate with her. It's well worth an investigation. The scene is really wonderfully written. Again, it reads, "The tenderness welled up in him," and I'm reading from page 162, "and he sank to his knees, his eyes at the foot of his daughter. He's approached his daughter from behind as she's washing dishes in this scene." Morrison calls it a tenderness, a protectiveness. He wanted to fuck her tenderly. But then Morrison writes, "But the tenderness would not hold." And so on and so forth. So that is worth a look. I mean, that is a rich thesis. And you could find all sorts of defense. There's also this paragraph on page 206, and I'll end with this for idea number 3, the sympathy for Cholly. This is back in the voice of Claudia, and this is the second to last paragraph of the novel, so it's the sort of aftermath. And Claudia is thinking, oh, she's thinking of Pecola. Oh, some of us loved her. Loved is in quotation marks. The Maginot Line, and Cholly loved her. I'm sure he did. He, at any rate, was the one who loved her enough to touch her, envelop her, give something of himself to her. But his touch was fatal, and the something he gave her filled the matrix of her agony with death. Love is never any better than the lover. Wicked people love wickedly, violent people love violently, weak people love weakly, stupid people love stupidly, but the love of a free man is never safe. There is no gift for the beloved. The lover alone possesses his gift of love. The loved one is shorn, neutralized, frozen in the glare of the lover's inward eye. So, again, I would encourage you to perhaps pursue the notion of Morrison's project of creating sympathy for a tough character to sympathize, for sure, come the end of the novel. But in the last moments of this video here today, I want to look at a thesis that argues that essentially what Toni Morrison is doing in this novel is arguing that language itself, and particularly narrative or storytelling, is violent in its very nature. And let me show you what I mean as we look at a few of these examples. So first, in one of the book's modernist, or you might even say at this point post-modernist flares or techniques, the novel opens with what would be a kind of elementary school primer, you know, like a reader, a first reader that you encounter in, you know, whatever grade it is, you really do start reading simple stories. And it starts, here is the house. It is green and white. It has a red door. It is very pretty. Here is the family. Mother, father, Dick, and Jane live in the green and white house. They are very happy. See Jane. She has a red dress. She wants to play. And so on. And what Morrison does, as you see right here, is she moves all of the words closer and closer together, kind of deconstructing this primer. And in fact, many of the sections throughout open with a snippet of the primer as a kind of introduction. We have cat and dog and father and mother and house and family and so forth. And the primer is, in many ways, Morrison's main target. It symbolizes the white primer, the white narrative, right? So this is a cute little story about mother, father, Dick, and Jane, and it tells of happy white people living happy lives. So that sort of structural technique shows us that Morrison's target here is language. And particularly, again, narrative. You know, this story of Mother, Father, Dick, and Jane is, well, a story. So example 2, of course, is really the Bluest Eye moment. Shirley Temple is the girl that sort of represents the image of the sort of perfect blonde-haired, blue-eyed little girl that everyone wants to be. And I'm going to read a brief paragraph here from page 19, and this is again from Claudia's point of view. And Claudia's just sharing how, well, she can't stand Shirley Temple, although her sister Frida loves her. Frida, that's her sister, brought her 4 graham crackers on a saucer and some milk in a blue and white Shirley Temple cup. She was a long time with the milk and gazed fondly at the silhouette of Shirley Temple's dimpled face. Frida and she had a loving conversation about how cute Shirley Temple was. So that's Frida and Pecola had this loving conversation about how, and it's written C-U-U-T-E, how cute Shirley Temple was. I couldn't join them in their adoration because I hated Shirley. Not because she was cute, but because she danced with Bojangles, who was my friend, my uncle, my daddy, and who ought to have been soft-shoeing it and chuckling with me. Instead, he was enjoying sharing, giving a lovely dance thing with one of those little white girls whose socks never slid down under their heels. So I said, I like Jane Withers. And I looked up Jane Withers, and here she is, another child actress of the time. Toni Morrison tells a powerful story about her motivation for writing The Bluest Eye. When she was younger, she was having a conversation with a friend. And the question, do you believe in God, arose. And the other girl, a young girl, said, no, I don't. And Toni Morrison said, well, why not? And the young girl said, well, I've been praying to God for 2 years to give me blue eyes, and he hasn't done so. So he must not exist. 30 years later, Toni Morrison writes this novel. And so that is our gift. Comes out of the suffering of this young girl with whom Morrison was speaking way back then. So clearly the takeaway here is, in a culture surrounded with images of whiteness and a culture that connects that whiteness to beauty and blue eyes and so on, well, represents a kind of problem. So that would be example number 2. Now, the examples are going to get a little bit more interesting, but this is how you go about building a thesis. You need to accumulate evidence. Once you have an idea, right, and ours is language is violent, then you need some evidence. You need to go into the text and find textual support. So let's see what we have for example number 3. I'd ask you to open to page 122, and let's look at this moment in Pauline's voice. That's Mother Pauline, when she starts going to the movies. She went to the movies instead. Again, I'm on page 122. There in the dark, her memory was refreshed, and she succumbed to her earlier dreams. Along with the idea of romantic love, she was introduced to another, physical beauty. Probably the most destructive ideas in the history of human thought. Both originated in envy, thrived in insecurity, and ended in disillusion. In equating physical beauty with virtue, she stripped her mind, bound it, and collected self-contempt by the heap. She forgot lust and simple caring for. She regarded love as possessive mating, and romance as the goal of the spirit. It would be for her a wellspring from which she would draw the most destructive emotions, deceiving the lover and seeking to imprison the beloved, curtailing freedom in every way. And you see where Pauline gets these ideas. The next sentence. She was never able, after her education in the movies, to look at a face and not assign it some category in the scale of absolute beauty. And the scale was one she absorbed in full from the silver screen. So here, the storytelling of Hollywood, the storytelling of movies is having a pernicious effect. It is screwing with Pauline's values. So, by this point, with the structural example of the primer, and then of course Pecola and her yearning for blue eyes, amongst a culture of Shirley Temples, and now with Pauline's education at the silver screen, we have quite an argument. But there are 2 final quotes before we're done here today that I think really bring the point home. So if you look at page 176, now this is just subtle symbolism. that Morrison is slipping in there into the text, but I think it makes for excellent defense for our argument. When Soped Church sits down to write his letter to God, there's a single sentence here. Well, he rose and he went to a tiny night table with a drawer from which he took paper and a fountain pen. And then here, a bottle of ink was on the same shelf that held the poison. A bottle of ink was on the same shelf that held the poison. And in this way, Morrison has equated writing and poison. Just to flesh out the story of the poison, after Pecola is raped by her father, her obsessive, neurotic need for blue eyes becomes ever more pressing, and she goes to this strange sort of fortune teller, miracle man who lives out sort of on his own on the fringe of town to ask for blue eyes. And Soped Church, meanwhile, has this really annoying dog. I think it's his neighbor's dog or his landlady's dog or something. And he just can't stand this dog's barking all the time. And so he tells Pecola to give the potion, and it's actually the poison, to the dog. And if the dog behaves strangely, well, then God deems that she shall have blue eyes tomorrow and evermore henceforth. And so Pecola, of course, gives this poison to the dog, and the dog, walks in wretched circles around the yard and has a kind of conniption fit. And this behavior of the dogs convinces Pecola that she will in fact get her blue eyes. So in this moment we see Soped Church writing a letter and at the same time administering poison, and in that way Morrison equates the two. And lastly, we have one last point of defense, and that is in essentially the novel's final pages. To sort of wrap up the story, Cholly rapes Pecola there at the kitchen sink in the scene that we've discussed, and then rapes her again in a scene that we never see but only hear about, and then flees. And that's the last we hear of Cholly. And Pecola is taken out of school for frankly kind of unclear reasons, but as if she in her own way is implicated in the crime. So she needs to be pulled out of school. And Pecola descends into psychosis. There's a chapter where she is talking to herself and staring into the mirror, and essentially having this kind of bipolar or whatever mad conversation. One part of her believes she has the blue eyes, and the other part of her doesn't see them, in fact, but the one part assures her constantly how beautiful they are and how beautiful she is, even as the other part can't seem to put the reality and the fantasy together. It's a wrenching scene, and it's only here, again, in this kind of conversation that takes place in Pecola's mind, that we even learn of a second rape. And again, Pecola's kind of mad thoughts are really pestering her, particularly about the second incident. So I'm reading from the top of 200. The voice says, "I wonder what it would be like." And Pecola says, "Horrible." The voice again, "Really?" Pecola: yes, horrible. Then why didn't you tell Mrs. Breedlove? I did tell her. I don't mean about the first time. I mean about the second time, when you were sleeping on the couch. I wasn't sleeping. I was reading, she shouts. And so there you have this interesting, rich equating of reading as being raped. In this way, Morrison again is showing us how language itself is an act. It is something we do, and it always has consequences. And the moral is we ought to be aware of language again as an act, or as she calls it in her Nobel Prize winning speech, an agency with consequences. So at this point, I think we've developed a great thesis. We have excellent defense. You might Google Toni Morrison and see if you could get a little quote from her or something to slip into your paper. And that's what I've done here. And it is, in fact, from her Nobel Prize speech. And here it is. She is worried, and she is this character that Morrison's talking about, but essentially it's herself. She is worried about how the language she dreams in, given to her at birth, is handled. She is worried about how the language she dreams in, given to her at birth, is handled, put into service, even withheld from her for certain nefarious purposes. Being a writer, she thinks of language partly as a system, partly as a living thing over which one has control, but mostly as agency, as an act with consequences. Narrative is radical, creating us at the very moment it is being created. So I've sort of taken this quote as well as all of our analysis of the Bluest Eye and put it together in a possible thesis. We'll take a look at this thesis and be done. Through her depiction of the pernicious effects of mainstream narratives and her symbolic linking of writing to violence, Morrison shows how language itself is a violent agency rife with dangerous and harmful consequences. There you have it. As we look here at a photograph of Toni Morrison, the great author, I will leave you with that thought. Again, I'd encourage you to investigate this novel on your own, pursue any of the ideas maybe that we've looked at today. I found preparing for this video challenging due to really my utmost respect for Morrison and her work. Her work is rich and meaningful, and as always, I encourage you to pick it up and read it in full. Read the original. But that's all for now. As always, thank you for joining me here at Daedalus U, and I will see you in the future.